Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Geary seminar. I'd ask that you turn your phones to silent for the duration of the seminar. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Bryan, who's a Professor of Migration and Social Policy here at UCD. His research interests are wide-ranging and have included modernisation of Irish society with a focus on the history of ideas and debates that have shaped its development and the intellectual history of social policy. And Bryan has written several books on these topics. His current research and most recent book is focused on how different understandings of moral issues and public morality influence thinking about social policy. So without further ado, Bryan, thank you.
Okay, hi, and thank you very much for coming along today. The idea of public morality is a concept I've been interested in for about 20 years. I got interested in it from reading work by H.L.A. Hart, who was a legal theorist who had a very sociological understanding of the law. And he wrote a book on the decriminalization of homosexuality at the time in the United Kingdom called Law, Liberty and Morality. And he talked about how, if you will, homosexuality was decriminalized in Britain at a time when, if you will, homophobia was rampant. And how all the legal system of the United Kingdom found ways to punish gay people for expressing affection in public, so that other offences, if you will, were retasked to work against gay folk, such as the offence against public morals, something created in the time of Oliver Cromwell, which is something to do with espionage, was now reinterpreted by the courts in terms of corrupting public morals by expressing same-sex love and affection in public. So what Hart took from that was this idea that the law basically, yes, is a system of rules, but it also has to have some sort of relationship to predominant values and norms in society. And there's a sort of a tricky dance at play here, so that you can change the law without underlying values changing. You can have laws that remain on the book that don't come to be ignored. Examples given by Hart were included such dead letter legislation, included various offences in parts of the United States, again to do with certain types of sexuality that just weren't enforced in many states, even though they remain technically on the books. So the relationship between the law and social norms is quite a complex one to be understood through a sociological lens, according to Hart. I became interested in the idea of public morality also by my interest in Irish intellectual history, as it affected our understandings of social problems here, and in particular the work of a guy called Jeremiah Newman, who became the Bishop of Limerick, but before that he was president of Maynooth College, and before that he was its professor of sociology. And he was a pretty good professor of sociology, but he was mostly a moral theologian as well, or a political philosopher. So he wrote a book basically around the time when John F. Kennedy was being considered, if you will, to be president of the United States, when there was something of a moral panic in the United States with the idea of the first ever Catholic becoming president of the United States, and therefore imposing potentially Catholic values into the American system in a way that people wouldn't have necessarily liked in a culture that was predominantly Protestant. And that was the moral panic of the moment. And Newman discussed the idea of public morality and the idea of what should the Catholic Church do? What should the Church do in terms of the law? And he argued that in a country like Ireland, where most people were Catholic, the Church should rightfully insist that lawmakers have a constitution and laws that reflected Catholic values. And that the purpose of doing this would be, in part, to shore up the faith and social norms of Catholicism within Irish society. So in other words, basically, there was a duty on Catholic lawmakers in Ireland to enforce a Catholic public morality, including laws on divorce and so on. And he argued that these laws, also had a symbolic importance. They continue to remind people of the broader sort of, if you will, nest of moral values associated with Catholicism within which the society was anchored. So it shored up, if you will, a particular moral view of the universe. The literature on public morality that developed after Hart in the 1960s, of which people like Newman were also part of, was mostly written by people who were conservatives who are worried about the decline of conservative public morality to do with issues such as sexuality, movie censorship, and a range of other things. So the discourse was one of the decline of public morality. So basically, we see a situation where in the academic literature on this, public morality is in decline, and instead what's taking its place is a greater accent on liberalism, the idea of liberal values, the right to be exempt from a public morality, if you will. So this was the tone of the debate. The book I worked on public morality and the culture wars was to try and understand the kinds of debates that we're seeing having come to the fore rather quickly in the last number of years, and trying to locate those in wider historical contexts, previous examples of the kinds of dynamics, kinds of issues going on here. And in the opening part of the book, I talk about how all societies have customs and social norms that influence how their members interact with one another. And public moralities are legally enforceable versions of this. So the literature on public morality that I was looking at to begin with was essentially legal theory. So public morality finds expression in laws that are focused on shaping or nudging the conduct of individual members of society. At various times, we see religious conservatives doing this, but more recently, we see people we might describe as progressives, with their own recipe about what constitutes a good society and strongly held views that various laws and codes should be in place that should enforce these, if you will, for society as a good thing, as a progressive thing. So there is a sort of a degree of commonality between what progressives, if you will, to use that sort of term very broadly, and conservatives in the past saw the law as being a tool to basically create a certain moral climate, a certain moral tone, and to enforce potentially various values. That's a way basically of embedding them in society as a positive thing. So if you're a conservative, certain conservative values are to be understood as very positive things. If you're a progressive, certain progressive values are to be understood as positive things. So there is a sense that public morality is something that the law does. You sort of see different things playing out, aspects playing out over time. In the book, I was concerned with three archetypical sort of approaches to this. And I'm thinking mostly about Anglophone countries that are common law jurisdictions. They're some of the wealthier English-speaking countries of the world within which similar debates have percolated. We can basically identify traditions of conservatism derived from Christian belief and theology, characterized beliefs in the individual moral responsibility of people and of a sinful human nature. It's quite important to say that when people talk about culture war conflict or culture war debates as trivial and silly, my personal view is they are anything but. People may be using colloquial language and it may be rather shallow on Twitter. But at the end of it and behind it all, people are engaging in fairly profound debates, whether they know it or not, about what it is to be human. In other words, these debates all have their philosophical hinterlands. And Christianity, Christian thinking, Christian ideas of what a person is, what moral responsibility is something that for many generations had huge influence in the West. To some extent, it was supplanted by liberalism, by secular liberalism, which in itself is also derived from ideas of individual moral responsibility located in Christian religion. And then more recently, we can talk about, more recently as in the last 250 years, we can talk about progressive ideas, essentially built around rejections of God-given moral law or beliefs in a fixed human nature. So these are big ideas to play with. These are big ideas to play with. And I think the one that perhaps we should look at first here is the one that perhaps is strangest to us, because I think people generally talk about culture wars as something whereby liberals fight conservatives, but there are differences within liberalism between kind of social liberals, in a sense, who mostly prioritize individual rights, responsibilities, and free speech, and progressives who basically have a more sort of transformative vision about what could constitute a good society. In trying to make sense of this, I looked at others before me who had tried to make sense of this, and many of the writers I ended up reading who seemed to put the most energy into trying to figure out how the world was changing, how the ways in which people were thinking was changing. And these were often people who were coming at it from a conservative or religious standpoint. There were theologians such as Charles Taylor. But another writer comes to mind here as well, and it's Philip Reeve. In The Triumph of the Therapeutic, Uses of Faith After Freud, 1966. So anyway, he and others who were kind of trying to understand how, if you will, the Enlightenment changed how people think about morality and ideas of the self, kind of turn first of all to Rousseau, who hypothesizes a natural self that's molded by the external world. So Freud, like Rousseau, emphasized external factors that influence the psychological development of the child into an adult. So what we're talking about here are ways of thinking about the self in ways that is different from that encoded into Christianity. And the big figure in Christianity and Christian thinking for me is St. Augustine, who in the Confessions and in other works, very early in the Christian era, basically offered a psychological account of what it was to be human, that also emphasized basically ideas such as original sin, the Christian idea that a human being had an imperfect nature and is inclined towards sin and should avoid occasions of sin, and therefore basically needed strong rules to basically help them live a good life. So Augustine, in a sense, was of the late Roman period, and whilst that was now Christian Rome, he sided with the lions as well as the martyrs in the Colosseum. The martyrs were clearly persecuted by the empire, but even unjust laws could keep sinful human beings in check. So this idea that you need law and order to keep sinful or flawed human beings in check is a sort of a key element of conservative approaches to thinking about social problems such as law and order. Even if you just think back at the Talbot Street thing of a few weeks ago, when we had a lot of brouhaha in the media about the attack on Talbot Street, about what should be done. More guards, punish the guilty. And then the other says, well, no, these are young people who haven't had a chance. Let's think in terms of services and supports. So, so these kinds of ideas are still with us in a sense. Now, I became really interested in this idea of therapeutic individualism, because basically there are things that are happening at the moment, I'll come to in a few minutes, that are puzzling. They're puzzling breaks perhaps with what up till very recently were fairly standard ways of understanding certain ideas and concepts that are hugely important for law and public policy. But the main idea that Reeve was kind of emphasizing in his account of this kind of post-Rousseau kind of individualism was that it's based on a natural self that is good until corrupted by the external world, which kind of translates into a view that basically the problems of society are external to people. So fix the external problem, don't be focusing on the flaws of the person, the stigmatizing the individual and so on and so forth. But another aspect of this was basically a way of thinking about the self, a way of thinking about the project of the self that could be a very emancipatory project in ever so many ways, that broke with Christian thinking. It broke with the Christian thinking of the idea of original sin, a flawed human nature. There's a joke to do with this kind of literature where Chesterton, a Catholic writer of the early 20th century, was asked, how would he fix the world's problems? He didn't say, well, I would basically dismantle global capitalism. He didn't say that. He didn't say, basically, I'd have a go at neoliberalism. He didn't say anything like that. What he said is, I would look first to my own sinful nature. So it's a classic sort of way of thinking about things. So the idea of a self that is curatable, the idea of the self that has autonomy, the idea of the self in a postmodern sense that isn't basically to be understood as having a fixed nature, basically changes how potentially we engage with the world. And these ideas have moved from just being things in books to being a very much part of our culture, the way in which we think of ourselves. And the terms used by people like Charles Taylor, Reeve, and others to describe this was basically the idea of therapeutic morality, therapeutic individualism, where the idea of curating the self, from the point of view of how a therapist might think about it, was the project of many of us. So that's quite a complicated idea. I'm going to come back to it in a minute. So Okay, I've got over this ground already, but broadly speaking, I would argue that conservatives and progressives similarly advocate for the enforcement of morals, but liberals advocate tolerance and freedom from the enforcement of morals. So up to relatively recently, we had a situation, say, for example, in Ireland, where a lot of conservative stuff, a lot of conservative legislation, and then basically social liberals and progressives both working together to basically challenge some of this. So that was the kind of alliance we had. But what I really think is perhaps one of the most fundamentally important ideas you could grapple with if you wanted to understand the culture wars at the moment is how basically understandings of harm have shifted. And I think this is very important indeed. So the idea of harming another person is a moral problem. You should not harm others. You should live your life without harming others. You should not subordinate another person to your ends if it is harmful to them. Those are sort of standard ways of thinking, and they are understood by the courts in various ways. But what has changed recently in the public domain is what we mean when we talk about harm. So therapeutic public morality kind of is exemplified by the right of an individual to define themselves, and it argues that those identities should be recognized by society. It breaks with liberal ideas of liberty that understand autonomy in terms of a right to free speech in the absolute sense, because it advocates curbing speech that might challenge somebody else's subjective sense of self. Examples of therapeutic public morality might include plans to prosecute or deplatform somebody who expresses views that are seen to be triggering, or to erase somebody else's identity merely because it challenges that person's sense of self. When the term erasing started entering the public discourse a number of years ago, I became fascinated by this and how it was used. And I never presumed that it was a sort of a trite thing, but that it spoke to a deeper sense, that the idea that somebody challenging your beliefs or views about yourself is harmful, directly harmful to you. That's a relatively new idea. As distinct from versions of harm that might include, say, physical harming somebody and so on and so forth. So some of the debates that we've seen, such as some of the conflicts around framing hate law legislation over the summer, have been really about trying to reckon with demands for perhaps a more expanded understanding of what we mean by harm, and what therefore is to be understood as legally hateful than before. So there's definitely an appetite for wider understandings of harm. They are natural outgrowths, ways of thinking about the self and the boundaries of self. I would add that they're aggravated by the era of the internet in ways that we couldn't have foreseen. Like, to be online is like being stuck in an elevator with a bunch of people shouting at you. They've reached into your very personal space. It isn't if you're basically living a quiet life until you choose to engage with others. In a sense, basically, we're rubbing up against each other in new ways and clearly new ground rules are needed at times to make sense of this. So, as always with social change, it's not just driven by ideology, it's driven by some sort of functional need or functional necessity as well, for some form of new settlement, something that makes things work better according to the needs of people as they express them. So, understandings of harm, moving on. Liberals, and the reason I would take liberals as a sort of baseline here is because conservatives have declined in influence significantly in Ireland in recent decades. Incitement to violence, that's harmful, but mostly not affected by free speech. But the exception, according to Oliver Wendell Holmes, an American Supreme Court judge in the early 20th century, very, very much influenced by John Stuart Mill, who remains the great theorist of liberalism, especially on all of these issues. Wendell Holmes said, free speech, always, except no shouting fire in a crowded building. If you shout fire in a crowded building and somebody gets trampled to death running, your speech act has demonstrably harmed them. So there are areas in which speech acts can be harmful unto others, but mostly they're not. On the progressive side of it, the increasingly defined by therapeutic individualism, subjective perceptions of harm that include challenges to a person's psychological sense of security or sense of self are now to be regarded as harmful in ways that weren't previously. Some of this is very good because if we look at things, say, such as racism, We know that racism is quite a complicated phenomenon, and basically it is damaging and hurtful towards people, or sexism or other isms. So yes, we do need to understand, as social scientists and as people trying to living in societies, the complexities of these things. One of the outgrowings of the kind of changes I'm talking about is a wider definition of harm, and a sense amongst many that if I define myself as harmed, that is harmed. That's the closest you're going to get to an empirical test of that. And that's quite a claim to make, especially since there are billions of us in this world all coming up against each other with different points of views at time and so on and so forth. So basically, expanding definitions of harm. Now, when we think about basically how all of this stuff, public morality, the kinds of issues I'm dealing with relate to social problems. Sorry, I'm going to move on to this one first. I want to talk about a slight elaboration on the earlier thing, going back to the conservatives briefly. What are the differences, say, between conservative understandings of human nature and the self and progressive ones? Human personalism, which is Catholic language, but really the idea that you have a supernatural nature, that you're not just a person, you have a soul. Pessimistic, human nature is flawed, original sin. That the big problem in society is ultimately a problem of individual moral failure. And public morality is necessary because of human weaknesses and flaws. In other words, you have to side with the lions as well as with the Christians in the Colosseum. The progressive, if you will, aspect or angle to this is optimistic, that humans are intrinsically good, that human identities are variously malleable, socially constructed, and emancipatory projects of self-creation, that evil in the world is extrinsic. So if you look at, say, for example, many commentators will talk about neoliberalism or something like that as an evil, that it impacts upon people and societies. You get a sense about how these external forces are the evils of the world. Wide definitions of harm. Public morality is necessary to protect people from external harm. So there's a sort of a slightly different emphasis here. So when you basically look at the sort of conflicts that take place around public morality, the Irish version, the closest we've had to it is the hate crime legislation. There are people of good faith on both sides. Some are arguing we need hate crime legislation that protects people from their subjectively experienced harm. This needs to be very broadly defined. Others are saying, well, hang on a second, you're coming up against free speech here. You're kind of going too far with this. It's very hard to operationalize this if you're just relying on terms that are entirely subjective in meaning. So there are kind of, if you will, conceptual issues here. But I think the idea of understanding of harm is fundamentally useful to unpick some of these kinds of things. Now, when we move on to kind of thinking about social problems, I mean, most of us have been, who are working in the teaching of, say, social policy or the social sciences, who say, look at the past, we can see that things such as the understandings of poverty have changed over time. If you look at people like Malthus, and I teach this to my first year students, Malthus' understanding of poverty is very much rooted in the idea that human beings are flawed, need rules to correct them, that basically they need to engage in providential and prudent behavior. They need rules that help them do this. That stigma is a good thing. Stigma is a useful tool when you lack other tools to get people to behave in a way that is basically not just socially acceptable, but beneficial to their own well-being also. So if there's a stigma against lone parents, we see that from our present-day vantage point as a terrible thing. But from somebody like Malthus, that early 19th century point of view, women who were children outside wedlock, or working people who had families so large they couldn't afford to feed them, against possibility of children dying, of immense suffering and hardship. And the only tool they had at their disposal was basically prudential behavior, and if stigma helped them get there was a case for that. So that's not a way we perhaps think today. But the other side of it is we also are quite willing and interested in stigmatizing certain types of behavior today, because they are harmful towards others. So, in the workplace, I think we would stigmatize homophobia, sexism in ways that would have been done a generation ago even. And we would see the benefits of doing this. So stigma is a tool. And whenever you talk about stigma and the mobilization of social norms, whether you're encoding it in law or not, you're basically thinking about some aspect of the public morality debate. Public health. smoking bans, drink driving, prohibitions on alcohol. These are all topics that have been subject to basically lots of legislation handled differently in different countries at different times, aimed at protecting people from harm. Protecting people from harm. The prohibition of alcohol in the United States, the Great Prohibition, was driven by progressives. You know, it was driven by first-gen feminists. It was driven by evangelical Christians who all saw drink as immensely harmful to poor people in particular. So you have the vista of early 20th century feminists going in with their pickaxe handles and smashing up saloons. So this is robust stuff. And these people were, in the vernacular of the time, parts of religious awakenings. They were the woke. So there is an etymology around some of these terms as well. And you can draw some parallels between these kinds of religiously based movements and perhaps modern sort of moral crusades of various kinds as well. But you wouldn't want to overdo the similarities. They're often trying to achieve quite different ends. Sometimes the techniques and tools can be the same. So prohibition is also really interesting, and I have half a chapter on the book. And what I'm really interested in that one is how Catholics and Protestants responded so differently to the idea of prohibition. Prohibition happened in the United States, Canada, the Nordic countries, wherever Protestant majorities, debates about prohibition were on the agenda because they cleave to a very Augustinian idea of sin and sinful behavior and so on. Where strangely the Catholics had a sort of a looser kind of, not looser is the wrong word, so nuanced or different approach to some aspects of morality. And it was an awful lot of the first literature at the time on temperance. And I looked at a journal published in the early 30s, and a number of articles on how all the temperance movements went and how they fell in different countries and so on. And this is a Slovak piece quoted by an Italian scholar who was essentially a Catholic. And he talks about how during the Prohibition, he says, I say give people good food, good fresh air, good beer, wine, and whiskey. Prohibition is the biggest crime a person can imagine. God will punish this country. They give the good stuff to the sewers and the bad stuff to people. I say give people the good beer, the good whiskey. And this is tied into theological ideas that if God made it, it must be good, but it can be misused. So there are nuances in Christianity about this. So prohibition was essentially a Protestant phenomenon. Whereas at the same time, the Catholic Church got to dominate cinema censorship in the United States and held it for 35, 40 years. Why? Because if a Catholic said a film is okay to watch and could say that to the pulpit or ban a movie, that 30 or 40 million, but there was no way that the sort of decentralized Protestant churches of America would agree or disagree on anything at that particular time. So the deal was done between the Jesuits and Hollywood to give us the Hays Code that basically defined cinema censorship for a long time. So some of this was below the level of law, but it was also about basically organizations or constituencies saying we want to use our influence to have our values recognized in the public sphere. So those kinds of things here. Crime and social order, I already alluded to Talbot Street, but the idea as to whether you should be punishing the criminals or reforming or rehabilitating them is a debate, and it requires to be treated with a degree of sophistication. And then when we think about, say, some of our own more modern legislation, sex and gender equality, equal status legislation, EDI employment policies, such as we have now at UCD very recently, hate crime legislation to be discussed, views about prostitution/sex work, very different from different points of view. So there are disagreements between people, and they are based back to sort of some of the older ideas that I'm talking about here. Poverty, prohibition, and public health. So religious conservatives expect a person to do difficult things and to face their moral responsibilities. Progressive ideology can depict people more so as victims and argue that responsibility lies elsewhere. Secular progressive approaches to social justice tend to depict stigma and the meanings of oppression. For example, these will argue, certainly in the teaching of social policy, say in our school, a lot of emphasis has been placed on the kind of the so-called distinction between the so-called deserving and undeserving poor, and how these would have needed to be eradicated and so on in the implementation of social policy. Alcoholism is another thing where essentially we see different therapeutic approaches to alcoholism over time. The idea that alcoholism is a disease replaces the idea that alcoholism are a failure in a sense. So we also see basically a growing emphasis on preventative health measures. And one of the things that really intrigued me was not which got a huge hearing for a number of years here and another 4 on campus and elsewhere. So nudge theory is a way of basically getting people to do the right thing without engaging with them about whether it's the right, but having a conversation without engaging in the politics of it, saying that you can sort of depoliticize and turn into governance, moral regulation issues. And there is a fair bit of that about as well. But nevertheless, expectations that one should take responsibility for one's own health, not smoke, limit one's consumption of alcohol. These can be public morality issues too. So the idea of public morality as a tool of public policy doesn't go away. It just recasts itself at different times as having different points of emphasis. Now, I was kind of looking for, where are we talking here now? I want to go ahead and go into one controversial area. A lot of the conflicts that are playing out in line at the moment about public morality and the culture war conflicts, especially around the transgender issue, are not necessarily in Ireland or the UK between conservatives and social liberals, but they are between, if you will, almost different branches of the liberal/progressive camp. And you know, these come back to kind of, if you will, the extent to which, say, feminist movements and different waves of feminism are rooted in ideas of seeing sex differences as real, understanding perhaps that prostitution can be harmful, and so on and so forth. Having a form of secular humanism that has an awful lot in common at the end of the day with the Christian humanism. So if you want to basically, I don't know, look at a radical feminist of the sort of second wave like Andrea Dworkin, and look at her views on prostitution and put them beside a conservative voice at that time like Mary Whitehouse, you'll sort of see a huge Venn diagram. Prostitution is harmful to women, harmful to families, etc., and so on. So they kind of, whereas you would have a sort of a third wave of feminism, influenced perhaps by queer studies and so on, that would basically take these broader views of emancipation and argue much more for individual autonomy. And it's really these kind of conflicts that are playing out, say, often around in kind of some of the more heightened cultural war ones that are playing out on the campuses have resulted in a number of high-profile court cases, such as the Joe Phoenix one going on at the moment. Edinburgh University is caught up in one today where a book by some social policy scholars is being, the local union, or if you will, writing letters and saying, boycott the launch, etc. today. And so these sort of conflicts are playing out. But they're kind of conflicts between second wave feminism and allied things and perhaps other more so-called more progressive or progressive ways of thinking about gender, sexuality, and so on and so forth. But they kind of really, so we're kind of seeing some sort of funny novel or new sorts of developments, especially since 2015, when we've had our marriage equality and so on. So it's as if the political debates have now accelerated onto a next phase. So I think you can map these kinds of debates onto the kind of things that I'm talking about. Just getting newly there with the slides there. Where are we at all? Yep, okay. So, okay, sorry, I missed what I did there. Yep, the UK census, right. I got it, okay, kind of, yeah. I was looking for sort of working examples of this for today, and one of the things I came across was basically some debate about the census question in the United Kingdom for 2021. Now, I'm somebody who's used to working with the idea of race and ethnicity and know how absolutely difficult it is to have an adequate categorization on any census. So if you break people down into black, Asian, white, other, etc., you know, do you capture everything? Do you capture every nuance? But what we're now seeing in the recording of administrative data is a growing emphasis on gender identities and where these are to be found. And there has been some degree of contention where gender identity classifications have been put in lieu of or in place of the old male-female distinctions. Now, the right answer to this question is probably to have both and to be able to map your data that way. But there's a case study here done by Alice Sullivan, Sex and the Census, Why Surveys Should Not Conflate Sex and Gender Identity. And that came out in 2020, and there are follow-up articles by Sullivan as well, which looked at the findings of the 2021 census. Now, The census findings, I don't know if I have the last two slides of the version I sent during the day. No, I don't. I have two. Anyway, that's my last slide. I have the stuff here in front of me. So Sullivan is kind of saying a fairly standard thing. We need to accurately record data. We need to disaggregate it by sex. We need to continue to understand the difference between men and women, and so on and so on. So she would be very much understood as a sort of a gender critical, feminist, empirical social science, social policy academic. And she'd be a leading figure in that one. But there were some sorts of problems with the findings of the 2021 census. And it was because the way in which the question was framed when people were asked about their gender identities. And the language of this, I guess the people framing it were trying to come up with a suitable language that would not be offensive and would fit with the expectations around that. But a lot of people, or some people, misunderstood the question. And therefore, the findings of the census indicated that there were certain groups of people far more likely to be transgender than other folk in the UK. And these were people with lower level educations and who couldn't speak English. So in other words, basically, the findings were somewhat distorted by the framing of the question. So we're living in an era at the moment where there's quite a lot of debate about terminologies. And there's even in the response, say, of the Minister of Justice to the debates on the hate crime legislation, one of the arguments coming back, or it's in the mix there somewhere, is that the terminologies are going to keep changing. They're going to keep changing. We're going to be using different terms all the time here. So we don't know what to put down. And then other folk are saying, well, hang on a second, unless you have a fixed meaning for a term, you really shouldn't be putting it under law. So these kinds of things. So the conflation that took place at the margins of 2021 census data in the UK, you find similar kinds of problems with the interpretation of data around, say, race, ethnicity, and so on, in terms of how these things are used or operationalized. But it kind of points to the sort of challenges going forward about how some of this stuff gets encoded into our administrative practices, census making, use statistics, how we record data, and so on and so forth, especially if there are political demands that, if you will, gender identities be at the forefront of this, as distinct from, say, sex differences or sex, if you will, categories and so on and so forth. So there's quite a lot of undecided stuff here, and my own kind of guess with it is that it's going to keep evolving, and that eventually, yes, you get some settlements for a time around some of these issues, and that the progressive sort of ideas, the main ones, are certainly not going to be put back in the box because they reflect deeper sociological change in our society, a very secular society, very comfortable with, say, things that perhaps we didn't imagine we'd be comfortable with 10 years ago, around same-sex marriage, ideas of gender and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, also some sorts of kind of political sorts of problems around some of this. What's really interesting at the moment is that if you look at organizations like the ACLU, the American Organization for Civil Liberties, and equivalent organizations, that a generation ago, these would have been very much attacking conservative ideas as the main thing. And basically, so you had an alliance of the liberals and progressives against conservative majorities. In other words, but in some contexts, in some settings, where progressive ideas have kind of come to the fore, the political alliances that we're seeing are now ones sometimes between conservatives and liberals. Liberals basically because they're supportive of a right to exempt oneself from public morality, and conservatives because they're deeply uncomfortable about what is being offered in lieu of their preferred idea for the good society, which is a very secular public morality. And it's quite interesting when you think about it, how many people, say in the United States, who are Christian conservatives are also drawn towards ideas such as libertarianism, which from their point of view give them an ideological framework for exempting themselves from the laws and rules of the state and to carry on in their own way. Homeschool movements, the Burkes in Ireland, people like that. So there's an awful lot of, there's kind of a hinterland of ideas that are playing out around these kinds of debates all the time. But there are nevertheless ongoing implications for public policy, for social policy, because we have to interpret these ideological debates. We have to interpret these understandings of harm. They get encoded in the law. They can influence things such as prison policy, education policy, education about sexuality and gender in schools, and so on. And some of these can become at various times controversial topics. But nevertheless, basically, but I'll stop there. Thank you very much.